Well, in our series on the Old Testament people, I debated about the book of Judges. How do I approach this? I can pick and choose a few judges, but I think what I'm going to do is just do the whole book. Just so you get a feel for the judges. So the book of Judges begins with 2 chapters regarding the continuing efforts to conquer the Canaanites. The people ask God, and the first chapter is just an example. I'm going to read the first chapter to you more or less, and then we're going to jump into the second chapter, which is really where the book of Judges continues or begins. The first judge that is going to be brought up in chapter 2, his story is actually told in chapter 1. Kind of set the feel. So the people asked God, Joshua's died. Who's going to lead us in our battles? God told him, Judah will. So did you notice that God didn't ask for a volunteer? He simply said Judah will lead. And by that he meant the tribe of Judah. Why do you think God chose Judah? Think about it for a moment. Was it because God knew that eventually the great king David would come out of the tribe of Judah? Maybe. However, there might be another reason. A couple of lessons back, I pointed out that Caleb was from the tribe of Judah. I mean, that's probably like 5 or 6 weeks ago, when they went to spy on Canaan. He was, and not because he was from the tribe of Judah, I'm not saying that's why, but let's pull them together. Caleb was now easily the oldest member of Israel when Joshua dies. He's probably about 85 years old at this time. He says, I'm as strong and healthy as I was when I came to Canaan as a spy, which was 40 years before. So there were virtually no adults, or very, very few, that, were, well, if you were an adult when you left Egypt, you didn't go to Canaan, except for Caleb and Joshua. So maybe God chose Judah because he knew Caleb was in there. Do you think? I do. But the Bible doesn't tell us that, so that's just supposition. So the men of Judah asked the Simeonites to join them in attacking. They told the Simeonites, help us clear our land, and then we'll help you clear your land. So pay attention, and you'll see that without Joshua, the Israelites no longer fought as one group. While each tribe had at least 20,000 fighting men, a sizable force, most of the tribes had over 30,000, and a couple had 70,000. So significant fighting forces, but if you combine them, they're almost undefeatable. That's what we saw. Do you think Christians could learn from that? If every church in a city united with all the other churches in that city, tasks that seem difficult to overcome could easily be handled, right? What do I mean? Well, how about constant hospital visits? Oh, I don't mean everyone visiting one person, but I mean having people in the hospital visiting, talking to those who want to have visitors, talking to family. How about creating a massive food bank? Here in Cheyenne, we've got one church in particular that does a great food bank, but they're still limited. If all the churches together did a food bank, wow, that'd be a food bank. How about helping senior citizens? Who does that? I know of one church that does, but they're limited. How about a great youth program? Cheyenne's got two or three that are pretty good, but none I'd call great. I used to do the youth ministry. I know what they're looking for. Or at least what they were looking for 50 years ago. 45, whatever. I don't know what they're looking for today, but I know Cheyenne doesn't provide it. I've heard it. And can you imagine all of those with just your church? No way. Not enough people, not enough budget. We can't do it. But if you had every church in the city united, and assuming every church just has 10% of their people get involved, because that's a high number, you could do a lot. But most Christians aren't going to do that. They don't want to sit on their hands and complain, we just can't do it. Get off your butts and do something. Anyway, that's not in my notes, so don't quote me. So Judah and Simeon started with a battle against 10,000 Canaanites and Perizzites, and then they attacked Jerusalem, Hebron, Deborah. Before they attacked Deborah, Caleb said, whoever leads the attack, they get to marry my daughter Aksa. Evidently, she was very beautiful, according to Jewish tradition. And certainly her beauty would have motivated her, but also the daughter of Caleb. Wow. Kind of a prestigious wife. Well, Othniel stepped up, led the attack. They finished off Deborah. And then Kiriath Sefer and Zephath and Gaza and Ashkelon and Ekron, and God was with the Judites, and they took possession of the hill country. But they could not defeat the people on the plains because they had chariots with iron shields. As Moses promised, Caleb got the land he scouted out. Meanwhile, the Benjamites did not clear out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. That resulted in problems later on. The two half-tribes of Joseph conquered Bethel, but the men of Manasseh did not drive out the Canaanites. Eventually, they forced the Canaanites to work for them, but they never drove them out. The Ephraimites did not drive the Canaanites out of their land. The Zebulunites did not drive the Canaanites out of their land. Asherites failed to drive the Canaanites out of their land. Naphtalites failed to drive the Canaanites out. The Danites could not defeat the Amorites. And so they were confined to the hills. God had said, totally drive the Canaanites from the land. You think if somebody right about here asked God back then why they couldn't clear the land, what do you think God would have said? Did you think about that? It seems to me like God's most likely response would have been something like, if you had remained united, you could have cleared the land. Do you agree? All right, so Judges begins in chapter 2, and God gives his response to all of this. He told the people, I don't know, did he speak to all of them, or did he tell Joshua or Caleb? Joshua's still alive at this point. Chapter 1 said he was dead, but that, like I said, that was flashback. Maybe he spoke to Joshua. He said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you to the land I promised to your ancestors. I will never break my promise, but you have not kept your end of the covenant I made with your ancestors. You have made agreements with the Canaanites, did not tear down their altars. Why have you disobeyed me? I promised to drive the Canaanites out of the land, but you have allowed them to stay, and you have already started to worship their gods. Already. Hearing what God said, the Israelites began weeping. They offered sacrifice to God. And Joshua sent the Israelites away. That's what the Bible says. You know, the Bible gave no indication that the Israelites made any attempt to drive the Canaanites out at this time. What lesson can we learn? Think about it for a moment here. Well, how about this lesson? If we say, I'm sorry, God, but we do not change our behavior, then God will not fix our mistakes. Don't we need to say, I'm sorry, God, and then make some changes to our lives, our actions, our behaviors? We're told the people worshiped God until Joshua died, and the generation that knew Joshua died eventually. The Israelites then began serving Baals and doing other things, totally ignoring God. Now, looking ahead, the word judge means a godly person that rescues the Israelites. The judges were sort of like a leader of their tribe, and they were sort of like a priest. The end of Judges 2 is an overview of the pattern of the times of the judges. It says, God then allowed raiders to successfully plunder their possessions and take many of them prisoner. When the Israelites tried to fight the raiders, God gave them no help whatsoever, so they were defeated every time. Israel became extremely distressed, so God gave them some judges to help them, but the people refused to obey the judges. Instead, they worshiped their other gods. Every time God gave them a judge, he would bless the judge, so the Israelites would be saved as long as the judge lived. And we're going to see that. But when the judge died, the people returned to their little gods. Judges 3 begins with a list of the Canaanites still living in Canaan. Are you ready? Philistines, Canaanites, Sidonians, Hivites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Jebusites. The Israelites married their women and allowed their men to marry Israelite women. They served the gods of these Gentiles, which God had prohibited. Why did God prohibit Jews from marrying Gentiles? Does this type of restriction apply to Christians? Why do some Christians teach it's wrong to marry someone who's not a Christian? And then they will pointedly ask me, do you believe it is wrong to marry a non-believer? Putting me on the hot seat, huh? And my answer is absolutely it's wrong. Go to 1 Corinthians 7, see what Paul has to say about it. I knew a youth minister that shared this story, and I'm going to read it as he shared it. His name was Mike Moore. He said, as a youth minister, I had an average-sized young high school girl stand on a chair. I had one of the star football players stand on the floor. Then I told them to clasp their right hands together. Next, I told the young lady, when I say go, I want you to try to pull him up to the chair. I told the football player, when I say go, I want you to try and pull her off her chair. To no one's surprise, the football player easily pulled the young lady off the chair. He graciously made it easier for her to land without losing her balance. Then I repeated the process, but put the football player on the chair and the young lady on the floor. It surprised everyone, especially the football player, when the young lady pulled him off the chair. The football player said it wasn't fair. He was out of balance, leaning forward to reach her hand. I smiled and said, thank you both for helping me. Then I continued to everyone, when you marry someone who is not a believer, you are like the person standing on the chair. It is very difficult to pull someone up to your level, but it's very easy for the other person to pull you off the chair. The chair represents your faith. Do you understand? Everyone was nodding, but unfortunately several of them continued dating their non-believer friend. Of course, several of them later on married their non-believer friend. It should not surprise you that all of those stopped attending church sooner or later. People, I will say it again. I I do believe it is wrong for a Christian to marry a non-Christian. So Othniel is here's a short story of Othniel, who was in chapter 1. The Bible says, eventually God allowed Aram to rule over Israel for 8 years. When the Israelites finally begged God for rescue, God sent a judge named Othniel, the son of Caleb's younger brother. He was from the tribe of Judah, and Othniel was empowered by God, and he led the Israelites in their fight for freedom. The Israelites were successful in freeing themselves, and they lived in peace for 40 years until Othniel died. Ehud's era began around 40 years after Joshua died. And that's about the time that Othniel died too, by the way. It didn't take long after Othniel's death before the Israelites went back to their ungodly way of life. This time, God allowed Moab to rule over Israel. Moab allied themselves with the Ammonites and the Amalekites in order to defeat Israel. Moab ruled over Israel for 18 years. Finally, the Israelites repented and asked God to save them, but God sent a Benjamite named Ehud to deliver the Israelites. Ehud went to the king of Moab with the tribute Israel paid him. He presented the tribute to the king, and then he left, along with the Israelites who had carried the tribute. They had not gone far before Ehud turned around and returned to the king and told him he had a secret message for him. The king told his people to leave him alone. Ehud had concealed a short sword under his clothes. As he approached the king to deliver his message, the king stood up. Ehud drew his sword and stabbed the extremely fat king in the belly. The king was so fat, Ehud couldn't pull his 3-foot-long sword out of the king's belly. Ehud locked the doors on his way out. When the king's servants returned, they assumed the king was relieving himself. They waited quite a while, but when the king did not unlock his doors, they eventually unlocked the doors and found the king laying on the floor dead. Ehud escaped during that time, and upon reaching Ephraim's hill country, he blew a trumpet. Now the Israelites were waiting for him, and they followed Ehud, defeating the Moabites, killing 10,000 of them, every single soldier that had pursued Ehud to the Jordan River. Israel then took control over Moab and lived in peace for 80 years until Ehud died. Well, not every judge is listed, and here we're going to get a real short story about Shamgar. We're told very little about him. Why is he even mentioned? Because God wanted him mentioned. And there are going to be 5 more judges mentioned briefly, and actually a couple other people. Sometimes the Bible doesn't even name people. It isn't important. What's important is the lesson. So Shamgar became a judge in Israel. He killed 600 Philistines with a 6-foot-long stick that was used to control oxen. End of story. The next story begins with after Ehud died. That suggests Shamgar was a judge in a different area of Israel than where Ehud served or where the next judge served. Shamgar and Ehud's ministries seem to have occurred during the same time. I don't know, maybe. All right, so next, it's been about 120 to 130 years after Joshua died, and we have Deborah's story. After Ehud died, the Israelites returned to their fake gods and did many evil things. So God allowed a Canaanite king named Jabin to rule over them. King Jabin's general was Sisera, and he had 900 chariots with iron shielding. King Jabin was cruel to the Israelites during the 20 years he ruled them. Finally, the Israelites turned to God for help. Now there was an Israelite prophetess named Deborah, and the Israelites went to her when they had disputes. One day she sent for Barak, a Naphthalite. Deborah said, Barak, God wants you to take 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun. You are to take them to Mount Tabor. God will lead Sisera there with his chariots and soldiers. God will give you victory. Barak says, I won't go unless you go with me. Deborah said, Of course, I will go with you, but because you insist on that, you will not be given credit for the victory, because Sisera will be killed by a woman. Time out. Was Deborah a judge? Well, she was settling disputes, but she didn't lead them into war. Barak did that. Was he the judge? Were they both judges? Huh. And Sisera is going to be killed by a woman. And that's why Deborah's going, right? We'll see. Barak gathered 10,000 men, led them to Mount Tabor. Deborah went with them. Heber was one of the Kenites who he had traveled with, the other Kenites that traveled with Israel when Moses was leading them. But he'd left the other Kenites, and he told Sisera that Barak was on his way to Mount Tabor with an army. So Sisera gathered his army and went to Mount Tabor. Deborah told Barak to head down the mountain and attack Sisera at the Kishon River. The Israelites killed all of Sisera's army, except this Sisera escaped on foot. He came to the tent of Heber's wife, Jael. She invited him to hide in her tent, covered him with a blanket. Since he was thirsty, after a battle, of course he was thirsty, she gave him some milk to drink and then covered him up again. Sisera told her, Stand in the doorway and tell anyone that comes by, no one's in here. Now Sisera was exhausted and soon fell asleep. Jael then picked up a tent peg and hammer, and she quietly went over to Sisera and drove the tent peg through his temple and into the ground, killing him. I don't think she liked him. Barak came looking for Sisera, and Jael went out of her tent. She told him, Look in my tent. Barak saw Sisera. Then the Israelites went and destroyed King Jabin as well. Israel had peace for 40 years. Well, next we have an unknown prophet. Now pay attention to a slightly different story here. This story is about a prophet, not a judge. What was the difference? Well, maybe the prophet just brought a message from God. And that's all. We'll see. So eventually the Israelites started doing evil things. So for 7 years, God allowed the Midianites to rule over Israel. Israelites built hidden homes in the mountains using caves and so forth. And when they planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other nations from the east would invade. When they invaded, they would destroy the Israelites' crops and kill their animals. So many invaders would come through that with all their armies, it was like a swarm of locusts had gone through, destroying everything. There were so many, nobody could count them. The Israelites were so poor. No crops, no animals. They had nothing. They finally cried out to God for help. So God sent them a prophet to remind them that God brought them out of Egypt, rescuing them from slavery. He told them God had warned them against worshiping the gods of the Amorites, but they didn't listen. So what was different about the prophet's story? Seems like he just brought a message that didn't help Israel at all. That's what I think. All right, next week we are going to look at my favorite judge, Gideon. Kind of a long story. Go ahead and read it. Be prepared. See what you think about Gideon.